So, I want to start by thanking everyone for being here, thanking Studying Women's Philosophy in Ireland for organizing today, and introducing myself, and then we'll get into my work. So, thank you, SWIP. My name is Artemis. I'm a dual graduate student doing 2 degrees at once, one in Gender Politics and International Relations at UCD back in Dublin, and then the other is in philosophy at GCAS, which is a little bit newer institution, but they're great. But yeah, so let's get right into it. Because today is about taking the work partially done by my undergraduate thesis, partially extended in my first trimester of grad school, and deepening it and hopefully opening the conversation about epistemology for transfeminine individuals. Because the denial that transfems and trans women face, very deep denial. So this is my part of what I'm going to go over, but I want to foreground, before we get into the literature, I want to foreground some context. In the US, also much closer in the UK, civil and human rights frameworks have been, and this is covered in the literature, have been polarized against civil and human rights for trans people, especially trans women, with trans women as a hypervisible target. And in my argument and in some of the literature, both that I've contributed to and read, I argue that one of the most precarious and marginalized intersections is being transfeminine. But when you look at the literature kind of aligns. There's a lot of people, both journalists and academics across disciplines, who have contributed to this problem and trying to deconstruct and explore. And unfortunately, I think that speaking as both, or someone who wants to be an academic full time, but is also currently a journalist and is kind of wearing both hats. The people who have contributed to the negative, to the regression of rights, know who they are. I think they're proud of themselves, but they are unworthy of the titles they carry. Their words aren't worth the ink or internet packets that's transmitted upon. Some additional context, some reporting that's not made it into academic literature because it's brand new, is that the U.S. is de facto denying passports to trans people and denying accurate ones, de facto, de jure, denying them at all. But that's why I want to get into the actual philosophical literature, and I'm going to sit down because I like standing. My back hurts. So when you have philosophy literature, some of what I found in my paper on was a literature from 2022 by Carter that discusses both the Bovarian, which is from second wave feminism, and Butlerian, which can be understood as kind of modern, socially constructed sex and gender. And in that literature, it's found that even on the gender conservative framework, even within what the most exclusionary elements who argue against trans women's inclusion as women, that trans women are or are becoming female. Further, that medical transition, we know enough about medical transition to argue that there should be equal footing between endogenous and exogenous sex characteristics, and that in either framework, whether the second one from this Bovarian or the newer Butlerian framework or philosophy of sex and gender, that trans women should be a part of the biological group of women. As for my own work, I argued in my undergraduate thesis defense that trans women are women socially, hormonally, well, for nature, politically, economically, and biologically, or completely in a word. And again, we know enough medically, philosophically, and politically to attest this, despite the deliberate underfunding and recurrent destruction of the relevant knowledges. Which brings me to empiricism. There's a preprint from 2024 that argues that trans women should build for trans women, especially those most marginalized among us, that which is usually trans women of color. Depending on the context, that can look a little different, but especially in highly racialized contexts like the U.S., or any Western context where there's a degree of racism, unfortunately. Anyways, by building for trans women, we will eventually build something that works for all. Building from the margins, and Dr. Michael DeVito's argument I'm drawing from here is the only equitable way to build. If we don't do that, if we continue to build from the center, the norm, we just reinforce the exclusion, the denial, ultimately the precarity, which precarity is considered an economic phenomenon, but I argue it's much more than that, especially for trans feminine individuals. So getting to that, again, drawing on my own work, but that is currently under peer review. The preprint of my thesis demonstrates that trans women are forced into precarity on the axis of being trans women. In other words, there weren't any other social, economic, or identity factors that some populations that face precarity can find in the literature. You can find that, like, having a certain level of education or a certain level of family connections can rebuff or intensify precarity. In my studies, the data from my thesis, the data is clear. There's no dependent variable that mediates that relationship. Being a trans woman alone is enough to force you into a very deep precarity. In terms of economics and political science, 43% of trans women or more in the U.S., according to my thesis data, are locked out of full-time employment. Almost 30% are unemployed. It's not great. But what that brings me to is the implications, the philosophical implications of what we see in the political and economic materiality. And so that precarity is not only a thing that applies to trans women, it's deeply far-reaching from a feminist or trans feminist point of view. It is it's a punishment for rejecting the position of patriarchal citizenship. And further, it's a tacit admission by the system that trans women are women, or in other words, enough people know that trans women are women, and that not only that, but trans women are some of the most acceptable targets for patriarchal abuse and act accordingly. And so getting back to empiricism, epistemology, knowledge is authority. Trans women are women denied. And if we don't break the cycle, that's just going to continue and continue probably forever. And the cycle is the cycle of the triple bind and raised memory, which, drawing from the literature and my own work, I coined both of these terms. Raised memory, I borrowed from Latin, but really raised memory works don't have to translate it to Latin. I coined it to describe a process by which trans women are denied and forcibly removed from both collective and social memory and stored records. So we're denied a history, we're denied a present, and we're denied a future all at once. Despite the fact that trans women have existed within humanity since its dawn and will be there at humanity's extinction. Raised memory is, like I said, the process by which trans women are denied a voice, a history, a present, and a future all at once. I also argue that it is key to the epistemic denial that Dr. and Michael DeVito talked about in her preprint and other trans feminists have done work on. To understand raised memory, imagine, this might be a silly example, but imagine the dinosaurs weren't made extinct by a plasma accident. It wasn't some big meteor or whatever. They were deliberately wiped out by a society of social beings, but in that world, the dinosaurs and their means of extinction were both erased, altered before they could enter the fossil record, and what did enter the fossil record, a little bit of records available, was something so contradictory to what dinosaurs actually were, there's no way of knowing what they were. And that erasure also erased knowledge of society's own crimes in doing this. I argue that's what it is for trans women and raised memory. It is a complete deprivation of not only knowledge and knowledge's authority, but the ability to be remembered. Which brings me to another term I coined in my work called triple bind. This is not an extension of the double bind that may or may not be familiar with. It's kind of covered in the undergraduate's first level women's studies course in many cases. The double bind is, you follow one patriarchal expectation, you trip up another. You can't win. The triple bind exists in parallel to that. The triple bind is coined specifically to describe the experience of transfeminine populations, but it could apply to others. It exists in parallel to the double bind, and it's a combination of race memory, which I just explained, and precarity, which is an economic condition, but I also argue it's a knowledge condition, because if you don't have the resources or knowledge of who or what you are, or to fight back against your precarity, that precarity that enforces the lack of resources and knowledge is the cycle. And then the final mechanism of triple bind is visibility, specifically hyper-visibility, as a mechanism of both surveillance and violence. And the best way to understand this is that hyper-visibility for trans women is not privilege, it's not representation, it's not media, it's not powerful representation. It's, hey, look at that monster, track it, kill it. It's that kind of surveillance with inevitable violence. Or in more cases, it's, hey, look at that, let's cut out this disease. Which brings me back to the numbers for my epistemic arguments, because I situate my arguments in both the materiality and the philosophy, so looking at the hard data, the qualitative data, and the lineage of ideas all at once. And I argue that the visibility as violence comes from total epistemic denial and erasure. And to elucidate this before I get into the numbers, but other than today, right now, when was the last time we heard from a trans woman? Versus when was the last time we heard about a trans woman? And what's that ratio? Think about that. We may be visible, but we're rarely heard from or rarely listened to. Most of the discourse about trans people in general, especially trans women, is not on our terms. It's not about us. It's not with us or for us, and my argument is ultimately to change that. So when you look at the numbers, in my thesis, I demonstrated, this is all US-based trans women, so it may be a little different up here, but 85% of trans women have said that they have been denied equally seen as a human, 72% from being an authority on their own life. What is epistemics if not an authority of knowledge? Not being heard or listened to when you need help, 70%. Misrepresentation in species, this is also 70%. Retribution for what you do or say, no matter how benign, 64 to 65%. These numbers may stagger you, but they didn't shock me. From lived experience, I honestly thought the retribution statistics would be higher. I thought they would be in the 80s, but I was clear about it. Anyways, but when we look back to epistemics and look at, okay, how do we undo this? How do we build knowledge as buying for trans women? The short answer is it's not in the literature, and I don't have the complete answer. I would be lying if I tried to say I did, and I don't know. What I do have are some deeply considered thoughts that draw on the literature, intra-community, transfeminist conversations, and my own lived experience on how maybe we can get there. In other words, some lived lessons from my own experience. And so, to start off, tell stories. I deeply believe this, that a transfeminist way of knowing, a way of being, as far as I practice it, and as far as I've seen others practice it, is a story that we tell. It's our story. It's our stories. And this could be fiction, this could be nonfiction, this could be academic, this could be journalistic, this could be poetry, it could be prose, it doesn't matter. Tell stories. I also believe that as trans women, as transfems, we are uniquely positioned to tell society's shattering stories, but that the burden is unfortunately on us to choose to do so. Next, we have declare what is happening, and I use that framing borrowing from kind of radical histories of saying that by declaring what is happening, you are doing something radical to challenge power. That is what motivates my ongoing journalistic work. In addition to being a grad student and hoping to do my PhD next year, I'm also a journalist for my own outlet as well as another small press. And to boldly declare what is happening is, in my view, an act of resistance, not just against authoritarianism, patriarchal backlash, all of that, but also against the underlying status quo of patriarchy and capitalism. Declaring what is happening and telling stories I find are incredibly compatible. And that whether you're working across fiction or nonfiction, it reflects a real lived experience from intelligence story. We to the next step, which is be real but not simple. This was very clear in the qualitative aspect of my study, which I did this first trimester, expanding on the quantitative for my undergrad. Assessment of threats and possibilities is something all transfems have to do. It's deeply a transfeminine experience. Multiple of my qualitative studies participants said they described in their own words a constant reasoning of threat assessment. Am I safe at all times, in all senses? One of my participants had the best phrase for it, and that was tricky calculus. And it all ties back to that denial of authority and that denial of the knowledge is about us are not by us, and they're not for us. And mostly they're correct. So in response to that, I believe that you have to balance the best and worst case scenarios. For me, that looks like having multiple backup plans at all times running in parallel. So if something doesn't work out, I can opt to something else because I don't have resources. And most times we don't. That if I don't plan ahead and have a backup plan already ready to go, one piece of bad news, do the piece of bad news. I'm already so on the edge. And that's true in the community feminist discourses that I'm drawing on. It's true to a degree the literature I'm drawing on. From my perspective, trust is earned. If we ever could, we can no longer afford to trust deeply until it is proven, unless it is earned. I'll treat others with a baseline level of trust, but once they show me they haven't earned it, I have to immediately revise my expectations and threat assessments. And it goes back to that tricky calculus. And then for the final two, we have respect is performed, and visibility is both a threat and a necessity. Respect is a performance art. For transfems, we must always perform respect, even in the most contemptuous cases, or we will have further violence directed at us. And others we are connected with. It never just happens to us. There's always splash damage. My hope is that as the work is done, not just by trans women, but also by allies, to build transfeminist ways of being and knowing, like I said, they're being built, but there's no clear literature on it. It's happening now. That power relationships will shift enough that as trans women, we can access a more contemporary understanding of respect as mutually reciprocated. And importantly, we have to perform respect without ceding the framing or arguments of those who don't and never will respect us. So we must respect ourselves and perform respect to others. And then finally, visibility is a threat. It's also a necessity. A colleague of mine in journalism once said to me, visibility is a shared community resource. She's not wrong. So while the state of being hypervisible forced upon transfems is a threat and facilitating inevitable violence, until that violence happens or between periods of violence, we can also use it to connect with others, build community, build solidarity, and ultimately use that community to build new knowledges for ourselves. And again, as Dr. Michael Adovito argued, once we build something for ourselves, because we're building for some of the most marginalized, it'll eventually work well. If you map from the margins, you get it all. It takes time. But that, whereas if you map from the center, you never get the margins. And so I believe that as we build, visibility and structure in the past will remain inevitable and automatic, but they'll become increasingly dangerous. It's my hope that once we have robust systems of community care and alternative ways of being and knowing that don't require patriarchy's consent, that we'll become progressively less vulnerable to what it means to not be sanctioned by patriarchy. While trans women are some of the most not sanctioned by patriarchy, that applies to women in general, and it applies because the way patriarchal construction works, and I'm sure everyone in this room knows, manhood is not only the default, in many ways it's the only gender, and that is granted anything, and women have to exist underneath that. So in conclusion, I guess the literature, my own experience, my own study, and the philosophical contribution I hope to have today is that not only must we build from the margins, but we must draw on the experiential data, the inter-community discourse to do so. And I hope that this presentation and this associated paper can be one of the many shells that breaks that ground. If you want to connect with me, my CV will pop up after my references on some QR code. And that's it. Thank you.